At 10:17 on the morning of March 2nd, 1943, Captain Jim Hammer Dalton sat in the cramped cockpit of a B-25 Mitchell bomber, named Devil's Advocate, watching 8 Japanese warships cut through the Bismarck Sea like gray steel sharks. He was flying at 240 miles per hour, but altitude wasn't on his side. He was skimming 60 feet above the waves, low enough to see individual sailors on the destroyer decks, low enough to feel the salt spray coating his windshield like tears. Ahead of him, the lead destroyer Shikanami bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Every barrel was trained on the horizon, waiting for the high-altitude bombers the Japanese knew were coming. The standard playbook said Dalton should be at 10,000 feet right now, dropping bombs to a northern bomb site, while a bombardier did complex trigonometry in the glass nose. The standard playbook was about to be set on fire. Dalton wasn't looking through a northern sight. He was looking through a crude ring sight welded to the cowling, the same kind of sight a fighter pilot would use. His thumb rested on a red firing switch that the manufacturers said would never work. The armorers had called it a death trap. The aeronautical engineers from Wright Field had written a 47-page report explaining exactly how it would kill him. Dalton had used that report to level a wobbly workbench. The destroyer grew larger in his windscreen, 800 yards. 600 yards. He could see the Japanese gun crews scrambling, swinging their 25mm cannons toward his nose. They were shouting orders. They were loading shells designed specifically to tear aluminum airframes into confetti. The manual said this approach, head-on, at mass height, against a warship, was mathematical suicide. The manual said a medium bomber had no business picking a fight with a destroyer. The manual said a lot of things. Jim Dalton stopped caring about the manual the day his brother's troop transport was torpedoed off Guadalcanal. He squeezed the trigger. The nose of the B-25 didn't fire. It erupted. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns open up simultaneously. That's 90 rounds leaving the aircraft every single second. 3,600 rounds per minute of armor piercing. Incendiary death. The recoil hit the airframe like a sledgehammer to the chest. The entire plane shuddered. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burning cordite and superheated metal. The noise was so loud it drowned out both engines. But the nose didn't tear off. The glass didn't explode. The jury-rigged, unauthorized, technically legal mounting system, that Frankenstein's monster scavenged hydraulic dampers, motorcycle springs, and railroad shock absorbers, held together. Down on the water, the Shikanami started coming apart. To understand why a 38-year-old captain was flying a bomber like it was AP-38 Lightning, you need to understand the scoreboard in early 1943. The United States Army Air Forces wasn't just losing. They were hemorrhaging credibility, fuel, and men while accomplishing almost nothing. The problem was simple. The entire bombing doctrine of the Pacific Theater was built on a beautiful lie. The lie was called precision high-altitude bombing. The generals in Washington had sold Congress and the American public on the idea that a B-17 Flying Fortress, cruising at 20,000 feet, could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. They had newsreels. They had charts. They had the Northern bomb sight, a $8,000 piece of classified optical computing machinery that was supposedly so accurate it could change the nature of warfare. In theory, it was revolutionary. In practice, against moving ships in the Pacific, it was an expensive way to kill fish. Here's the math that nobody wanted to talk about. When you drop a 500-pound bomb from 20,000 feet, it takes approximately 43 seconds to reach the water. During those 43 seconds, a Japanese destroyer traveling at 30 knots covers nearly 800 yards. That's half a mile. The ship's captain has time to receive the spotter's warning, order evasive action, turn the wheel, light a cigarette, and watch the bomb splash harmlessly into empty ocean. The hit rate for high-altitude bombing against moving ships in 1942 was 0.6%, not 6%, 0.6%. Less than one bomb in every 150 drop actually hit anything. The Army Air Forces was burning millions of gallons of aviation fuel, expending thousands of bombs, and risking hundreds of lives to achieve what amounted to statistical noise. Meanwhile, The Japanese were running the most efficient resupply operation in the Pacific. They called it the Tokyo Express. Fast destroyer transports moving under cover of darkness, reinforcing garrisons across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Every night, thousands of tons of supplies and fresh troops poured into Japanese-held territory. Every night, the noose around Australia tightened. The Supreme Allied Commander in the Southwest Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur, was not a patient man. He looked at the bombing reports, saw the dismal accuracy rates, and did what generals do when their subordinates fail. He screamed. The man who received most of that screaming was General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force. Kenney was different from most Air Force generals. He had started his career as a mechanic. He understood that wars weren't won by doctrine written in comfortable offices. They were won by finding creative ways to kill the enemy before the enemy killed you. Kenney looked at his fleet of B-25 Mitchell bombers and saw wasted potential. The B-25 was a good aircraft, fast, rugged, reliable, but it was configured all wrong for Pacific War. It had a glass nose where a bombardier sat on a little cushioned seat, peering through a delicate optical sight. It had a few defensive machine guns scattered around, mostly pointing backward to discourage enemy fighters. It was designed to run away from fights, not start them. Kenney needed something that would run toward the enemy. He needed a ship killer. He needed something so violent and unexpected that the Japanese wouldn't know how to counter it. He needed Captain Jim Dalton. Jim Dalton wasn't supposed to be in the Pacific. By age and experience, he should have been instructing fresh pilots at some stateside training base, far from the shooting. But Dalton had volunteered for combat duty for the same reason a lot of men did. Revenge. His younger brother, Lieutenant Danny Dalton, had been aboard the transport ship SS President Coolidge when it hit a mine off Espiritu Santo in October 1942. Danny had survived the sinking, but had spent 6 hours in shark-infested water before being pulled out, half dead from exposure. The experience had broken something in him. He was evacuated stateside, but the nightmares never stopped. 3 months later, Danny put his service pistol in his mouth. Jim Dalton wasn't the screaming, emotional type. He was cold, methodical. The other pilots said he smiled when he flew combat missions, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the expression of a man who had found his purpose, and that purpose involved putting as many Japanese ships on the bottom of the ocean as physically possible. When General Kenney started asking for volunteers to test experimental modifications to be 25 bombers, Dalton was the first man through the door. The idea came from multiple sources. Australian pilots had been experimenting with low-level strafing attacks. A few maverick American crews had tried skip bombing, dropping bombs at wave-top height, so they would bounce across the water like stones and slam into the sides of ships. But nobody had put the two concepts together into one unified weapon system. Dalton proposed something that sounded insane: strip out the bombardier position entirely. Replace the glass nose with solid metal nose packed with as many .50 caliber machine guns as the airframe could physically support. Approach enemy ships at wave-top height. Use the guns to suppress the ship's anti-aircraft defenses. Then, while the Japanese were ducking for cover, release skip bombs that would bounce across the water and punch holes in the hull below the waterline. Turn the defensive bomber into an offensive gunship. The engineers at North American Aviation, the company that built the B-25, were not impressed. They sent a representative to Brisbane, Australia, where the 5th Air Force was headquartered. His name was Harold Eckstein, and he was not a man who enjoyed having professional judgment questioned by field mechanics. Eckstein brought technical manuals, stress analysis reports, and a condescending attitude. He explained very slowly, as if talking to children, why Dalton's proposal was physically impossible. The nose of a B-25 Mitchell was not designed to mount heavy weapons. It was a lightweight frame of aluminum stringers holding plexiglass panels. It was engineered to support the weight of one 160-pound man and a 22-pound optical bomb sight. A single .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun weighed 84 pounds. It fired a bullet the size of a large cigar at 2,900 feet per second. The recoil force generated by one gun firing was approximately 300 pounds of backward thrust. Dalton wanted to mount 6 of them in the nose. Eckstein did the math on a chalkboard. If you fired 6.50 caliber machine guns simultaneously from the front of AB-25, the combined recoil force would exceed 1,800 pounds. That force, applied to the delicate nose structure, would do one of 3 things: snap the rivets and cause the entire nose section to separate from the fuselage, crack the aluminum frame, and cause catastrophic structural failure, shatter the plexiglass and send shards of glass into the pilot's face at 200 miles per hour. Eckstein presented these calculations with the smug confidence of a man who had just proven that 2 plus 2 does not equal 5. He recommended that the entire project be abandoned and that Captain Dalton receive a psychiatric evaluation. Dalton listened politely. Then he thanked Eckstein for his time, escorted him to the door, and went back to the workshop. He wasn't building an airplane to pass an engineering exam. He was building an airplane to kill destroyers. The solution came from a diesel mechanic named Sergeant Lou Kowalski. Kowalski was a barrel-chested Polish immigrant from Detroit who had spent a decade working on locomotive engines before the war. He understood heavy machinery. He understood vibration, stress, and how to absorb violent forces without breaking expensive equipment. Kowalski looked at the problem and said, "You're thinking about this wrong. You can't stop the recoil. You have to eat it." The engineers at North American Aviation had assumed the guns would be rigidly mounted, bolted directly to the airframe. Of course that would shatter the structure. You can't absorb 1,800 pounds of force with aluminum rivets. Kowalski proposed a floating mount. Instead of bolting the guns to the frame, they would build a cradle, a heavy steel structure that held all 6 guns in a fixed firing position. The cradle would be mounted on rails that allowed it to slide backward. Behind the cradle, they would install a series of heavy-duty coil springs and hydraulic shock absorbers, the kind used on train locomotives to absorb the impact of freight cars' coupling. When the guns fired, the entire weapon's assembly would recoil backward into the springs. The springs would compress, absorbing the kinetic energy. Then, as the springs decompress, they would push the gun cradle back into the forward firing position, ready for the next burst. It was the same principle used in artillery pieces, scaled down and adapted for an aircraft. The official engineers called it mechanically unsound. They said the added weight would shift the center of gravity too far forward and make the plane unflyable. Dalton and Kowalski built it anyway. They scavenged parts from wrecked aircraft. They stole shock absorbers from a damaged Australian truck. They found heavy coil springs in a scrapyard in Sydney, springs that had once been part of an industrial stamping press. They worked 16-hour days in the sweltering heat of the Australian summer, welding steel, cutting holes in aluminum, and ignoring every regulation in the maintenance manual. The result looked like something out of a fever dream. The nose of the B-25 had been transformed from a sleek glass bubble into a blunt, ugly snout of riveted steel plates. 6.50 caliber machine gun barrels protruded from ports cut into the metal. The entire assembly was painted flat black, making it look even more menacing. The base crew called it the Black Death. A few called it Dalton's Folly. One young mechanic looked at it and said it looked illegal, like someone had committed a crime against aeronautics. That nickname stuck, the illegal firearm. Now came the hard part, proving it could fly without shaking itself to pieces. On January 15, 1943, Dalton climbed into the cockpit of the modified B-25 for the first test flight. He went alone. No co-pilot, no crew. If the engineers were right, if the recoil system failed and the nose tore off, he didn't want anyone else dying with him. The ground crew stood at a distance, arms crossed, waiting for disaster. Dalton pushed the throttles forward. The twin Wright Cyclone engines roared. The heavily modified bomber lumbered down the dirt runway at Port Moresby. It felt nose-heavy, sluggish. The engineers had been right about one thing. The center of gravity had shifted forward. The plane didn't want to rotate. It wanted to stay glued to the earth. Dalton hauled back on the yoke. The nose lifted grudgingly. The main wheels cleared the dirt by inches. The B-25 clawed his way into the humid air, struggling but flying. He climbed to 3,000 feet and turned toward the coast. The The moment of truth was coming. He armed the system. His thumb hovered over the firing button, a simple red toggle switch mounted on the control yoke. He squeezed it. The response was immediate and violent. The guns erupted with a sound like tearing metal. The entire airframe bucked. The cockpit filled with the overwhelming stench of gunpowder and hot brass. The instrument panel blurred from the vibration. For a split second, Dalton thought the engineers had been right, thought the plane was coming apart. Then the vibration stabilized. The recoil system was working. The steel cradle had slammed backward into the springs. The springs had compressed, eating the force. The hydraulic dampers had controlled the rebound. The nose hadn't torn off. The glass hadn't shattered. The ugly, improvised mounting system was holding together. Below, 6 streams of tracer fire arced down toward the ocean. The rounds converged at 1,000 yards, a focused cone of destruction. Dalton held the trigger for 5 seconds, watching the pattern. The guns didn't spray wildly. They stayed tight, controlled, devastating. He released the trigger. The guns fell silent. The smell of cordite was overwhelming, but the plane was still flying straight and level. Dalton allowed himself a smile. Not a happy smile. The cold smile of a man who had just built a weapon the enemy wouldn't see coming. He landed the plane and taxied back to the hangar. Sergeant Kowalski was the first one to reach the aircraft. He climbed up on the wing and looked at the nose assembly. The steel plates were blackened with soot. The gun barrels were still warm. But there were no cracks, no pop rivets, no structural damage. Well, Kowalski said, grinning, "I'll be damned." Word of the successful test spread quickly. Within 48 hours, General Kenny had ordered every available B-25 in the theater to be converted. There was no time to send them back to factories in the States. The modifications would be done in the field, using salvage parts and improvised techniques. Dalton set up a production line at Port Moresby. It was organized chaos, mechanics working around clock, cutting, welding, drilling. They turned out modified bombers at a rate of 2 per day. The planes looked rough. The paint was mismatched. The welds were ugly. But they worked. By late February, Dalton had a full squadron of these hybrid gunships ready. The pilots had been drilled relentlessly on skip bombing technique. They had practiced on the wreck of a beach freighter until they could put a bomb through a specific hatch at 200 miles per hour. They were ready. The Japanese weren't. On March 1st, 1943, Coast Watchers reported a massive Japanese convoy assembling at Rabaul. 8 troop transports, 8 destroyers. Destination, Land, New Guinea. If those troops landed, the Japanese would have enough force to push the Allies back to Australia. The convoy moved into the Bismarck Sea under heavy cloud cover. The Japanese commanders were confident. They knew American bombing doctrine relied on high-altitude attacks. They knew the weather would protect them. They didn't know the Americans had stopped playing by the old rules. March 2nd dawned with clearing skies. The Japanese convoy was steaming west in tight formation. Destroyers circled the transports, guns manned, eyes scanning the high sky. They were looking up. They should have been looking ahead. At 10 a.m., the horizon erupted with aircraft, but these weren't high-altitude specs. These were planes flying so low their propellers were whipping up spray from the ocean surface. The lead destroyer, Shikanami, didn't have time to react. Captain Dalton's B-25 came in at 240 miles per hour, 60 feet off the water. He opened fire at 1,200 yards. The 6.50 caliber guns in the nose roared. The recoil system slammed backward, then forward, feeding the next burst. A solid stream of armor-piercing, incendiary rounds hammered into the destroyer. The effect was catastrophic. The rounds punched through the thin steel of the gun tubs. They shredded the bridge. They killed the anti-aircraft crews before they could return fire. The Shikanami was being torn apart. At 300 yards, Dalton released his bomb. The 500-pound cylinder hit the water at shallow angle, skipped once, twice, and slammed into the destroyer's hull at the waterline. The delayed fuse gave Dalton 5 seconds. He pulled up hard, throttles to maximum, engine screaming. Behind him, the bomb detonated. The explosion blew a hole the size of a bus in the Shikanami side. The destroyer's back broke. It started sinking immediately. This scene repeated across the entire convoy. The modified B-25 swept through the Japanese formation like wolves through sheep. The skip bombs were lethally accurate. Nearly 60% hit rate, compared to less than 1% for high-altitude bombing. By noon, the Bismarck Sea was a graveyard. All 8 transports were sunk or sinking, for destroyers were gone. Over 3,000 Japanese troops were dead. The Americans lost 5 aircraft. The Tokyo Express was finished. When the reconnaissance photos reached General Kenny's desk, he stared at them in silence. Then he picked up the phone and called Washington. "I need you to authorize immediate production of modified B-25s," he said. "And I need you to send me a medal for Captain Dalton." "What kind of modification?" the voice on the other end asked. Kenny smiled. "The illegal kind." The engineers at North American Aviation, who had written the reports saying it couldn't work now, had to explain why a mechanic in the jungle had outsmarted their entire design department. They did what smart men do when proven wrong. They stole the idea. Within 6 months, the B-25J rolled off the assembly line in Kansas City with a solid nose packed with 8.50 caliber machine guns. The factory-built version used a refined version of Dalton and Kowalski's recoil system. They called it the Strafer model. The illegal firearm modification became standard doctrine. Captain Jim Dalton kept flying. He kept hunting Japanese ships until there were no more ships to hunt. On February 3, 1945, American forces liberated Manila. Dalton flew over the city, looking down at the streets his brother had once walked. After the war, Dalton went home to Iowa. He never spoke much about what he'd done. When people asked about the medal he kept in a drawer, he'd shrug and say he'd just been a mechanic who got lucky. But in the quiet moments, late at night, he'd think about that morning in the Bismarck Sea. He'd remember the recoil slamming through the airframe. He'd remember the engineers who said it was impossible. And he'd smile that cold smile. Because sometimes the manual is wrong. Sometimes the experts don't have all the answers. Sometimes a mechanic with a welding torch and a reason to fight can change the course of a war. Jim Dalton proved that innovation doesn't come from boardrooms. It comes from desperate men who refuse to accept that something can be done. He built a weapon they said was illegal. Then he used it to sink 12 ships in a single morning. And the world never forgot.